Give us that thing between your legs now, human. The demand echoed through the ornate reception hall, causing Richard Richardson to choke on his ceremonial drink. He'd expected cultural differences on the Bajoran homeworld, but this was beyond his wildest imagination. The human diplomat had arrived on Bajor mere hours ago, stepping into a world of sensual alien beauty. Towering spires of iridescent crystal pierced the lavender sky, while streets bustled with lithe, graceful Bajorans, their large, expressive eyes and intricate facial ridges. Captivated Richard, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched just as intently. As the welcome ceremony progressed, Richard noticed the Bajoran females eyeing his lower body with undisguised fascination. One in particular, a striking alien named Uko, seemed unable to tear her gaze away from his legs. Her piercing, violet eyes traced the contours of his limbs, lingering on his knees with an almost predatory intensity. The reception hall buzzed with excitement, filled with Bajoran dignitaries in flowing robes that accentuated their fluid movements. Richard tried to focus on the negotiations at hand, but the constant stares made him increasingly uncomfortable. He shifted his weight and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. That's when Uko made her move. She glided across the polished floor, her movements hypnotic and alien. "Human," she purred, her voice a mix of desire and scientific curiosity. "We must see that thing between your legs. Now." Richard's mind reeled, heat rising to his face. "I beg your pardon," he stammered, backing away from the advancing alien beauty. The Bajoran High Council intervened, their elderly leader stepping forward with an apologetic smile. "Forgive our directness, Ambassador Richardson. We refer to your knees, a fascinating evolutionary trait our species lacks." Understanding dawned on Richard, followed quickly by a new wave of discomfort. The council explained their species' long-standing mobility issues, believing human knees held the key to their advancement. Their proposal was as unexpected as it was unsettling: access to study Richard's knees in exchange for advanced Bajoran technology. Richard's diplomatic training hadn't prepared him for this. He tried to decline politely, but the Bajorans grew insistent. The atmosphere in the hall shifted, curiosity giving way to something more urgent, more demanding. Before he could formulate a response, a group of Bajoran scientists led by Uko surrounded him. Their eyes gleamed with scientific fervor as they reached for his legs. Richard's fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, adrenaline surging through his body. With a burst of speed that surprised even himself, Richard ducked under grasping hands and bolted for the exit. He sprinted through alien corridors, the sound of pursuit close behind. The human embassy was somewhere in this vast, unfamiliar city. He just had to find it. As Richard navigated the twisting streets of the Bajoran capital, he marveled at the alien world around him. Bioluminescent plants cast an eerie glow over the walkways, while strange creatures chittered from hidden alcoves. He had no time to appreciate the beauty, focused solely on escape. Ducking into a crowded marketplace, Richard's fingers flew over his communicator, sending an urgent extraction request to the human embassy. The message sent, he allowed himself a moment to catch his breath, hidden behind a stall selling what appeared to be living jewelry. Unbeknownst to Richard, Uko had broken away from the main search party. Her fascination with the human's agility had sparked something deeper, a questioning of her society's aggressive approach. As she stalked through the market, following the trail of startled aliens in Richard's wake, Uko found herself torn between scientific ambition and a growing desire to understand the human perspective. Richard crouched in his hiding spot, surrounded by the cacophony of alien commerce. Strange scents and sounds assaulted his senses as he anxiously awaited rescue. But time was running out. In the distance, he could hear Uko's voice, growing closer with each passing moment. The hunt was on, and Richard Richardson was the prize. Richard's heart pounded as he crouched behind the stall, the living jewelry writhing and glinting in his peripheral vision. The cacophony of alien commerce surrounded him, a symphony of unfamiliar languages and strange, chittering calls. He inhaled deeply, trying to calm his nerves, but the air was thick with an array of exotic scents, spices he couldn't name, fruits he'd never seen, and the unmistakable musk of countless alien species. His eyes darted frantically, searching for an escape route through the labyrinth of stalls and bodies. The market was a riot of color and movement, with Bajorans of all ages haggling over goods that defied human comprehension. Richard's gaze settled on a narrow alley between two towering structures, their crystalline facades reflecting the lavender sky above. Just as he prepared to make a break for it, a familiar voice cut through the din. "Human, I know you're here." Uko's call sent a jolt of panic through Richard's body. He ducked lower, pressing himself against the rough texture of the stall. His elbow knocked against something solid, and before he could react, a display of what appeared to be exotic fruits toppled to the ground. The resulting crash seemed to echo through the marketplace, drawing every eye in the vicinity, including Uko's. Their gazes locked for a split second, violet eyes widening in recognition. Richard didn't wait for her to react. He sprang to his feet, his body moving on pure instinct. He vaulted over the fallen fruit, ignoring the angry shouts of the vendor, and plunged into the crowd. The marketplace became a blur as Richard weaved between bewildered aliens. His superior agility allowed him to duck and dodge with ease, while behind him he could hear Uko's frustration as she tried to keep up. Her graceful movements, usually an advantage in Bajoran society, were now a hindrance in this frantic chase. "Please wait," Uko called out, her voice a mixture of willpower and something else. Concern. "I only want to talk." Richard didn't slow down. He burst out of the marketplace and into a quieter residential area. The sudden absence of noise was jarring, and for a moment he lost his bearings. Ornate buildings loomed on either side, their architecture alien and disorienting. He chose a direction at random and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It wasn't until he rounded another corner that Richard realized his mistake. He found himself in a narrow alley, facing a solid wall of iridescent crystal, a dead end. He spun around, ready to retrace his steps, but it was too late. Uko stood at the entrance of the alley, her chest heaving from the exertion of the chase. Richard pressed his back against the wall, his mind racing for a solution. But to his surprise, Uko made no move to approach him. Instead, she held up her hands in a gesture of peace. "Please," she said, her English broken but understandable. "No harm, understand." Richard blinked, caught off guard by her change in demeanor. He watched warily as Uko took a cautious step forward, her movements slow and deliberate. "Your knees," she continued, gesturing to her own legs. "Important to us, but your choice important too." As Uko spoke, her face a mix of genuine curiosity and concern, Richard felt his panic begin to subside. He studied her more closely, noticing for the first time the intelligence and compassion in her violet eyes. You disagree with the council?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse from the chase. Uko nodded emphatically. "Aggressive approach wrong. Want to understand human... you." Richard's diplomatic training kicked in, recognizing an opportunity for dialogue. He relaxed his defensive posture slightly, though he remained alert for any signs of deception. "Okay," he said cautiously. "Let's talk, but no tricks, and no studying my knees without my consent." Uko's face lit up with a smile that was at once alien and warmly familiar. She opened her mouth to respond, but her words were cut short by a sharp voice from behind her. "Step away from the human, Uko." A male Bajoran in a sleek uniform strode into the alley, his face set in a stern expression. Richard tensed, recognizing the newcomer as a security officer. "Gran," Uko said, her tone urgent. "This isn't necessary. We can tenacity this peacefully." Gran's eyes narrowed. "The council's orders are clear. The human is to be brought in for examination immediately." As Gran advanced, his hand reaching for what Richard assumed was a weapon, Uko did something unexpected. She stepped between Richard and the security officer, her posture protective. "No," she said firmly. "The human has rights. We cannot force him." Gran's face contorted with anger. "Stand aside, Uko. Don't make me arrest you too." The tension in the alley was palpable. Richard's mind raced, knowing he had to act quickly to prevent the situation from escalating further. In a burst of inspiration, he saw an opportunity to demonstrate the very thing the Bajorans were so fascinated by. With a swift movement that surprised even himself, Richard ducked under Gron's outstretched arm. He pivoted on one foot, using the momentum to sweep Gron's legs out from under him. The security officer toppled to the ground, his weapon clattering out of reach. Both Bajorans stared at Richard in awe, their eyes fixed on his legs. "That," Richard said, breathing heavily, "is what knees can do. But taking them by force isn't the answer. I have a proposal that could benefit both our species." Uko's eyes lit up with interest, while Gron, still on the ground, looked skeptical but intrigued. Richard took a deep breath, knowing that his next words could shape the future of human-Bajoran relations. "What if, instead of studying my knees directly, we collaborate on developing artificial knee joints for Bajorans? It's a solution that respects my autonomy while addressing your needs." Uko's face broke into a radiant smile. "Yes, this is perfect solution. Gron, we must take this to council." Gron slowly got to his feet, rubbing his sore back. He looked at Richard with newfound respect. "Your agility is impressive. Perhaps there is merit to your proposal." As the three of them prepared to leave the alley and head to the council chambers, Richard couldn't help but notice the graceful way Uko moved, despite her limitations. He found himself admiring her grit and compassion, feeling a connection he hadn't expected. Uko caught his gaze and smiled, a faint purple blush coloring her cheeks. "Thank you," she said softly, "for showing us another way." Their moment was interrupted by the sound of commotion in the distance. Richard recognized the voices of human embassy officials, no doubt responding to his earlier distress call. The situation was about to become much more complicated. As they hurried towards the council chambers, Richard's mind raced with the possibilities and challenges ahead. He knew that the next few hours would be crucial, not just for his mission, but for the future of human-Bajoran relations. And perhaps, he thought, glancing at Uko, for something more personal as well. The Bajoran sun was setting, casting long shadows across the crystalline city. In the fading light, Richard, Uko, and Gron approached the imposing council building, ready to face whatever chaos awaited them inside. As they approached the council building, Richard's communicator buzzed insistently. The human embassy had arrived in force, their voices echoing through the streets. Richard exchanged a look with Uko and Gron, knowing they had precious little time before the situation spiraled out of control. The trio hurried into the council chambers, where chaos had already erupted. Human diplomats faced off against Bajoran officials, their voices rising in a cacophony of accusations and demands. Richard's eyes swept the room, taking in the tense faces and clenched fists. He knew he had to act quickly. Taking a deep breath, Richard stepped forward, his voice cutting through the din. "Esteemed council members, fellow humans, please. We have an opportunity here for understanding, not conflict." All eyes turned to him as he outlined his proposal. Richard spoke of non-invasive scans, joint research initiatives, and the potential for artificial knee joints that could revolutionize Bajoran mobility. As he talked, he could see the interest spark in the eyes of both humans and Bajorans alike. The council chamber fell into heated debate. Richard stood firm, answering questions and addressing concerns from both sides. Uko stepped up beside him, lending her support and offering insights from a Bajoran perspective. Hours passed in tense negotiation. Richard's throat grew hoarse, his legs aching from standing, but he persevered. Finally, as the Bajoran sun began to set, casting long shadows through the chamber's crystalline windows, an agreement was reached. The Bajoran First Minister rose, her voice solemn. "We accept your proposal, Ambassador Richardson, on the condition that you remain on Bajor to oversee this project personally." Richard nodded, ignoring the concerned murmurs from the human delegation. "I accept." In the days that followed, Richard found himself thrust into a whirlwind of activity. A state-of-the-art laboratory was established on the outskirts of the capital, its sleek architecture a blend of human and Bajoran design. Inside, advanced imaging equipment hummed, ready to unlock the secrets of human knee structure. Uko was assigned as Richard's primary research partner, a development that pleased them both. They spent long hours in the lab, poring over scan results and discussing the intricacies of joint biomechanics. Richard found himself constantly amazed by Uko's quick mind and insightful questions. During breaks, they explored the city together. Richard marveled at the alien beauty of Bajoran architecture, the way buildings seemed to grow organically from the crystalline bedrock. Uko, in turn, watched with fascination as Richard navigated stairs and uneven terrain with ease. One evening, as they walked through a public garden filled with bioluminescent plants, Uko stumbled on a rough patch of ground. Without thinking, Richard caught her, his hand steadying her waist. Their eyes met, and for a moment the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. Uko regained her balance, a faint purple blush coloring her cheeks. "Thank you," she said softly. "Your reflexes are remarkable." Richard smiled, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "Happy to help. Maybe soon we'll have you running obstacle courses." Their moment was interrupted by the arrival of Gron, who had been assigned as Richard's security detail. The Bajoran officer's face was a mask of professional detachment, but Richard thought he detected a flicker of disapproval in his eyes. As weeks passed, the research team made significant strides. Prototype knee joints were developed, each iteration bringing them closer to a viable solution for Bajoran mobility. Richard found himself at the center of media attention, giving interviews and demonstrations that captivated the Bajoran public. However, not everyone was pleased with the progress. A group of traditionalists, led by a charismatic politician named Toran, began to speak out against the project. They organized protests outside the research facility, their angry voices carrying accusations of human corruption and cultural degradation. Richard and Uko tried to focus on their work, but the growing controversy was impossible to ignore. One evening, as they left the lab, they found themselves confronted by a group of Toran's followers. The protesters formed a wall, blocking their path to the transport station. "Go back to your own planet, human!" one protester shouted, his face contorted with anger. Uko stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Please, let us pass. We're doing important work here." The crowd's response was drowned out by a sudden commotion. Richard caught a glimpse of something arcing through the air, a small, cylindrical object trailing smoke. Time seemed to slow as he realized what it was. Before he could react, Uko shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward. The explosive device detonated with a sharp crack, showering the area with debris. When the dust settled, Richard found himself on the ground, ears ringing, with Uko sprawled protectively over him. Gron and his security team swarmed the area, dispersing the panicked crowd. Richard's focus, however, was entirely on Uko. He helped her to her feet, checking her for injuries. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Uko nodded, her eyes wide with shock. "I'm fine. You?" "Thanks to you," Richard said, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how his hand still gripped her arm. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them. The air seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken emotion. Richard found himself leaning in, drawn by an irresistible force. A shout from Gron shattered the moment. "We need to get you both to safety, now!" As they were rushed away from the scene, Richard's mind raced. The attack had shaken him, but more than that, it had crystallized something he'd been feeling for weeks. His connection with Uko went beyond mere friendship or professional collaboration. It was something deeper, more profound, and infinitely more complicated. In the safety of a secure facility, Richard and Uko sat side by side, processing the events of the evening. The weight of their situation pressed down on them, the opposition they faced, the cultural chasm between their species, the potential diplomatic nightmare if things went wrong. Yet as Richard looked at Uko, saw the perseverance in her eyes and the gentle curve of her smile, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Together. These thoughts swirled in Richard's mind as he and Uko were escorted to a secure facility by Gron and his team. In the days following the attack, the atmosphere around the research facility changed dramatically. Gron, now fully committed to the project's success and Richard's safety, implemented a comprehensive security plan. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and advanced surveillance systems monitored every approach. Despite the heightened tensions, Richard and Uko refused to let fear derail their work. They dove back into their research with renewed vigor, spending long hours in the lab perfecting their designs for artificial Bajoran knee joints. Weeks passed in a blur of data analysis, prototype refinements, and countless cups of Bajoran herbal tea. Then, on a quiet evening, as Richard and Uko were reviewing their latest test results, it happened. "Richard, look at this!" Uko exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement. She pointed to a holographic display showing the stress distribution across their latest prototype. Richard leaned in, his breath catching as he realized what he was seeing. "It's holding up perfectly under Bajoran-level stress, and the range of motion. It's almost identical to your knees," Uko finished, a smile spreading across her face. They had done it. After months of work, they had created a prototype that successfully mimicked human knee functionality while remaining compatible with Bajoran physiology. News of the breakthrough spread quickly. Within days, the research team had recruited a group of Bajoran volunteers, eager to test the new joints. Among them was Mira, a young athlete whose dreams of competing had been cut short by her limited mobility. Richard watched with a mix of anticipation and nervousness as Mira took her first steps with the prototype joints. Her face lit up with wonder as she moved, each step more confident than the last. "I can't believe it," Mira said, her voice thick with emotion. "I feel normal, like I could run if I wanted to." Uko squeezed Richard's hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The moment was a powerful reminder of why they had undertaken this project in the first place. However, not everyone on Bajor shared their enthusiasm. As news of the successful prototype spread, so did opposition to the project. Toran, the charismatic politician who had spoken out against human involvement from the beginning, organized a massive protest outside the research facility. From the lab windows, Richard and Uko watched as thousands of Bajorans filled the streets, their angry chants echoing off the crystalline buildings. Signs denouncing human corruption and calling for Bajoran purity bobbed above the crowd. "I don't understand," Richard said, his voice tight with frustration. "Can't they see we're trying to help?" Uko placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Change is difficult for many. They fear losing what makes us Bajoran." The protests, while remaining peaceful, created a tense atmosphere in the city. Richard and Uko found themselves increasingly isolated, with many of their Bajoran colleagues keeping their distance to avoid controversy. In response to the growing unrest, the Bajoran Council called for a public debate between Richard and Toran. The event would be broadcast planet-wide, giving both sides a chance to present their arguments. As they prepared for the debate, Richard and Uko found themselves spending more time together outside of work. They explored hidden corners of the Bajoran capital, sharing meals in tucked-away cafes and long walks through bioluminescent gardens. One evening, as they watched twin moons rise over the Bajoran skyline, Uko turned to Richard with a serious expression. "There are rumors about us," she said softly. "People are talking about our closeness." Richard felt a flutter of anxiety in his chest. "Does it bother you?" Uko shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "No, but I worry it might make things more difficult for the project." Before Richard could respond, his communicator buzzed with an urgent message from Earth. His heart sank as he read the terse order to return home immediately. "What is it?" Uko asked, concern evident in her voice. Richard looked up, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "They want me to leave Bajor. Now." The night before the debate, Richard paced his quarters, wrestling with the most difficult decision of his career. On one side, his duty to Earth and the potential consequences of disobedience. On the other, his commitment to the project and his growing feelings for Uko. As dawn broke over the Bajoran capital, Richard made his choice. He would stay. The debate hall was packed, the air thick with tension as Richard and Toran took their places on the stage. Cameras hummed, broadcasting the event to millions of Bajorans across the planet. Richard began by presenting the scientific merits of the project, his voice steady despite his nerves. He introduced Mira, who demonstrated her improved mobility with the prototype knee joints, drawing gasps and murmurs from the audience. Toran countered with impassioned appeals to Bajoran tradition and independence. His words stirred the crowd, many nodding in agreement. As the debate progressed, the atmosphere in the hall grew increasingly charged. Supporters on both sides became more vocal, their shouts threatening to drown out the speakers. Suddenly, a group of Tauren's more radical followers surged forward, attempting to rush the stage. Security personnel moved to intercept them, but in the chaos, Richard saw one protester break through, heading straight for Uko. Without thinking, Richard leapt into action. He threw himself in front of Uko, shielding her with his body as the protester was finally subdued. The incident, broadcast live across Bajor, lasted only moments, but its impact would be felt for days to come. As Richard helped Uko to her feet, he became aware of a shift in the audience. The angry shouts had been replaced by a stunned silence, followed by a growing murmur of discussion. In the days following the debate, public opinion began to shift. Richard's act of selflessness had touched many Bajorans, causing them to reconsider their views on human involvement. More volunteers came forward for the knee joint trials, and the Bajoran Council reaffirmed its support for the project. However, Richard's troubles were a long way to go. A message from the Human Embassy informed him that a disciplinary committee would review his actions upon his eventual return to Earth. The potential consequences loomed over him, a constant reminder of the price of his decision. As Richard and Uko prepared for the next phase of their project, they found themselves at the center of a complex web of interspecies politics and personal emotions. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: their journey together was far from finished. Over. As Richard and Uko delved deeper into their research, the Bajoran Council took notice of their remarkable progress. Impressed by the success of the knee joint project, the council made a decision that would change the course of their work forever. "We're expanding the program," announced Councillor Varys, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "We're inviting scientists from other species to join the initiative." Richard and Uko exchanged glances, a mix of surprise and apprehension on their faces. The research facility, once a quiet hub of human-Bajoran collaboration, was about to become an interstellar melting pot of medical innovation. Within weeks, the labs bustled with activity as alien scientists from across the galaxy arrived. Among them was Dr. Zix, a Zenovian bioengineer whose reputation preceded her. Her silver skin glimmered under the lab lights as she examined the knee joint prototypes. "Fascinating work," Dr. Zix said, her multifaceted eyes scanning the holograms. "But have you considered incorporating Zenovian cybernetic enhancements? They could significantly improve functionality." Richard watched as unease rippled through the Bajoran scientists. Dr. Lon, a respected Bajoran researcher, spoke up. "We must be cautious. Our goal is to help our people, not to fundamentally alter them." The tension in the room was palpable. Richard cleared his throat, attempting to bridge the divide. "Perhaps we could explore a middle ground, integrating some enhancements while preserving Bajoran physiology?" As the debate raged on, Richard couldn't help but notice the strain it placed on his relationship with Uko. Late nights at the lab and constant mediating between different species left little time for personal moments. One evening, as they worked side by side, an Andorian scientist approached. "Fascinating," she said, her antennae twitching with interest as she examined Richard's legs. "Human knees are quite remarkable. May I, study them more closely?" Uko stiffened beside him, her discomfort evident. Richard politely declined, but the incident lingered between them, unspoken but palpable. Outside the lab, trouble was brewing. Tauren, though publicly discredited, had not given up his fight. He found allies among conservative alien species who shared his fears about the spread of human-inspired technology. In shadowy corners and encrypted communications, they plotted. "We must stop this abomination," Tauren hissed to his co-conspirators, "before it's too late." Their campaign of sabotage began subtly. Misinformation spread through the city like wildfire, turning species against each other. Equipment malfunctioned mysteriously, slowing progress. Richard and Uko worked tirelessly to keep the project on track, unaware of the forces working against them. Then came the day of the accident. A Bajoran volunteer testing an enhanced prototype suddenly collapsed in agony. His artificial knee joint spasmed uncontrollably, causing excruciating pain. The lab erupted into chaos. Richard and Uko rushed to the volunteer's aid, their faces etched with concern. As they stabilized the patient, Richard caught a glimpse of fear in Uko's eyes. "This isn't right," Uko whispered. "We tested that prototype extensively. Something's wrong." News of the accident spread quickly, reigniting public fears. Protesters gathered outside the facility, their angry chants echoing through the halls. Amidst the turmoil, Richard received a message from the human embassy. The words on the screen made his blood run cold. "Return to Earth immediately. Failure to comply will result in withdrawal of all human support for the project." Richard's mind raced. How could he abandon the project now, when it was facing its greatest challenge? Yet the consequences of defying Earth again burdened immensely on him. As he grappled with this impossible choice, Gron burst into the lab, his face grim. "I've found evidence," he said breathlessly. "The accident, it wasn't an accident. It was sabotage." Before Gron could elaborate, a commotion erupted outside. Shots rang out, and Gron crumpled to the floor, blood seeping from a wound in his chest. "Gron!" Richard shouted, rushing to his side. As he applied pressure to the wound, he locked eyes with Uko. In that moment, amidst the chaos and uncertainty, something shifted between them. The attack on Gron sent shockwaves through the research community. Security tightened, and an atmosphere of paranoia settled over the facility. The Bajoran Council called an emergency meeting. Richard and Uko found themselves summoned to testify, to defend their work and address the mounting safety concerns. As they prepared their presentation, working late into the night, Richard finally broached the subject that had been hanging between them. "Uko," he said softly, "I know things have been complicated between us lately." She looked up, her eyes tired but warm. "It's been a challenging time for everyone." Richard took a deep breath. "I want you to know, whatever happens, my commitment to this project and to you hasn't changed." Uko's expression softened. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "We're in this together, Richard. Whatever comes next." Their moment was interrupted by an urgent message from Dr. Zix. The Zenovian's face appeared on the screen, her eyes wide with excitement and fear. "I've discovered something," she said, her voice low and urgent. "About the sabotage. It's bigger than we thought. Meet me in the lab immediately." Richard and Uko exchanged glances, a mix of anticipation and dread coursing through them. As they hurried to meet Dr. Zix, they knew that whatever she had uncovered could change everything, for the project, for Bajor, and for their future together. The fate of their work, and perhaps the future of interstellar relations, hung in the balance. But as they walked side by side, their hands brushing against each other, Richard and Uko knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them united. Richard and Uko hurried through the dimly lit corridors of the research facility, their footsteps echoing in the late-night silence. As they approached the lab, they saw Dr. Zix pacing anxiously, her silver skin catching the light from nearby screens. "Thank goodness you're here," Dr. Zix said, her multifaceted eyes darting around nervously. She ushered them inside, sealing the door behind them. "What I've discovered, it's far bigger than we imagined." Dr. Zix pulled up a holographic display, filling the air with a web of interconnected data points. "The sabotage attempts weren't just Tauren's doing. Look at this." Richard and Uko leaned in, their eyes widening as they absorbed the information. The display showed a complex network of communications and financial transactions linking various alien species and corporations. "These species," Dr. Zix explained, her voice barely above a whisper, "they fear the knee-joint technology could give Bajorans a significant advantage in interstellar politics and trade." Uko's grip on Richard's arm tightened. "This changes everything," she breathed. As dawn broke over the Bajoran capital, Richard and Uko found themselves standing before the Bajoran Council. The chamber buzzed with tension, security personnel lining the walls in response to the recent attack on Gron. Richard stepped forward, his voice steady as he began their presentation. "Honored council members, we come before you today not just with updates on our project's progress, but with grave news of a conspiracy that threatens the very foundation of interspecies cooperation." Murmurs rippled through the audience as Richard and Uko detailed their findings. They presented evidence of the sabotage, backed by Dr. Zix's data, revealing the scope of the plot against their work. Counselor Varys leaned forward, her brow furrowed. Are you certain of these allegations? The implications are staggering. Before Uko could respond, chaos erupted. A group of protesters burst through the chamber doors, their angry shouts drowning out the council's calls for order. Security personnel rushed to contain the situation, but in the confusion, a lone figure slipped through the crowd, moving with deadly purpose towards Richard. Time seemed to slow as Richard saw the glint of a weapon. He froze, his mind unable to process the imminent danger. Suddenly, a blur of motion caught his eye. Uko, her movements fluid and precise thanks to her prototype knee joint, launched herself across the chamber. She collided with Richard, knocking him to the ground as a bolt of energy sizzled through the air where he had been standing. Security forces swarmed the would-be assassin, quickly subduing him. As the chaos subsided, Richard found himself looking up at Uko, her face inches from his. "Are you all right?" she asked, concern etched in her features. "Thanks to you," Richard replied, his heart racing from more than just the near miss. In the aftermath of the attack, the mood in the council chamber shifted dramatically. The assassination attempt, coupled with the revelation of the larger conspiracy, galvanized support for the project. Counselor Varys stood, her voice ringing out with newfound perseverance. In light of these events and the clear global and interstellar implications of this research, I move that we not only continue, but expand the knee joint initiative. The council voted overwhelmingly in favor. As an additional measure, they granted Richard special protected status, effectively neutralizing the human embassy's attempts to force his return to Earth. As Richard and Uko left the council chambers, they found themselves at the center of a media frenzy. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, not just about the project, but about their personal relationship. "Dr. Uko, is it true that you and Dr. Richard are romantically involved? How do you respond to allegations that your relationship compromises the integrity of the research?" Richard felt Uko tense beside him. He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. With a shared glance, they made a decision. Facing the cameras, Richard spoke clearly. "Dr. Uko and I are partners, both professionally and personally. Our commitment to each other only strengthens our dedication to this project and to the betterment of Bajoran life." The announcement sent shockwaves through Bajoran society. While many celebrated their union as a symbol of interspecies cooperation, others expressed outrage. Traditionalist groups staged protests, decrying the relationship as an affront to Bajoran values. Amidst the personal turmoil, work at the research facility intensified. The security breach prompted a facility-wide review, with stricter protocols being implemented. Gran, recovering from his injuries, provided key intelligence that led to the arrest of several alien operatives working within the facility. As news of the conspiracy spread, the project attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Alien species not previously involved reached out to the Bajoran government, expressing interest in joining the research initiative. "We're becoming a regular United Federation of Knees," Richard quipped one day, as they welcomed a contingent of Andorian scientists. Uko rolled her eyes, but couldn't suppress a smile. "Let's hope we can keep everyone's egos in check better than the actual Federation does." The rapid expansion brought new challenges. Cultural clashes between different alien species created tension within the research team. Richard and Uko found themselves mediating disputes as often as they worked on knee-joint prototypes. One evening, as they pored over data from their latest experiments, Richard noticed Uko's frustrated sigh. "What's wrong?" he asked, moving to massage her shoulders. "I just received word that Torin has disappeared," Uko said, leaning into his touch. "There are rumors he's fled off-world, possibly seeking allies among the species opposed to our work." Richard frowned. "He's like a bad penny, always turning up to cause trouble." Before Uko could respond, an alert chimed from their workstation. They rushed over, eyes widening as they took in the results of their latest test. "Richard," Uko breathed, "I think we've done it." The new prototype not only mimicked human knee functionality, but enhanced it, potentially giving Bajorans even greater mobility than humans. As the implications of their breakthrough sank in, Richard and Uko exchanged a look of mingled excitement and apprehension. "This changes everything," Richard said, echoing Uko's words from what felt like a lifetime ago. As news of their breakthrough spread, Richard and Uko found themselves thrust into the spotlight like never before. Hailed as heroes by many Bajorans, they also became targets for those who opposed the project and feared its implications. Walking through the streets of the Bajoran capital, now flanked by security guards, Richard marveled at how much had changed. Billboards displayed their faces, announcing public lectures on their work. Children played with action figures made in their likeness. "Did you ever imagine it would come to this?" he asked Uko, gesturing at a larger-than-life hollow projection of them on a nearby building. Uko shook her head, a wry smile on her face. "When I agreed to work with you, I thought the biggest challenge would be dealing with your human stubbornness. I never expected all of this." As they continued their walk, discussing plans for their next phase of research, neither of them noticed the hooded figure watching from the shadows, a communicator clutched in one hand. The figure spoke softly into the device. "They're on the move. Shall I proceed with the plan?" The response came back immediately. "Not yet. We need more information. Keep watching and wait for my signal." The figure melted back into the crowded streets, leaving Richard and Uko blissfully unaware of the new dangers lurking just out of sight. The busy streets of the Bajoran capital buzzed with activity, oblivious to the watchful eyes tracking the two scientists who had become household names across the planet. As Richard and Uko continued their stroll, a commotion near the central plaza caught their attention. A crowd had gathered around a large holoscreen, eyes fixed on the breaking news bulletin. "Unprecedented advancements in knee joint technology," the reporter announced, her voice filled with excitement. "The prototype developed by Dr. Richard and Dr. Uko has not only replicated human knee functionality, but has surpassed it, potentially granting Bajorans enhanced mobility beyond that of humans." Richard and Uko exchanged glances, a mix of pride and apprehension in their eyes. Their breakthrough had thrust them into the spotlight even more intensely than before. "I suppose our evening walks might become a bit more challenging," Uko remarked, nodding towards a group of Bajorans who had recognized them and were now approaching with eager expressions. Before Richard could respond, their security detail moved in, creating a protective barrier around them. As they navigated through the growing crowd, calls of congratulations and requests for autographs filled the air. Back at their apartment, Richard collapsed onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm starting to miss the days when we could work in peace without being recognized everywhere we go." Uko sat beside him, her fingers intertwining with his. "We knew this project would change lives, Richard. We just didn't anticipate how much it would change ours." Their moment of quiet was interrupted by the chime of their communication panel. Dr. Zix's face appeared on the screen, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. "You need to see this," she said without preamble. "We're receiving transmissions from all over the quadrant. Representatives from various species are requesting meetings to discuss our technology." Richard leaned forward, his fatigue forgotten. "How many species are we talking about?" "At last count, 17, Dr. Zix replied, "and the number keeps growing." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. The research facility expanded rapidly, transforming from a modest lab into a sprawling complex that housed scientists and diplomats from dozens of alien species. Richard and Uko found themselves at the center of it all, their days filled with meetings, presentations, and negotiations. The Bajoran government, recognizing the immense potential of their work, established a new department dedicated to managing interstellar negotiations related to the knee joint technology. As they walked through the newly constructed wing of the facility, Richard marveled at the diversity around them. Andorian engineers debated with Tellarite physicists, while Vulcan scientists conferred with their Romulan counterparts in a rare display of cooperation. "It's incredible," Richard murmured to Uko. "A few months ago, we were working in a small lab. Now look at us. We're at the center of a galactic summit." Uko nodded, her eyes scanning the bustling corridor. "It's more than we ever imagined. But Richard, I'm worried. When was the last time we had a moment to ourselves?" Before Richard could answer, Gron approached them, his face serious. "Doctors, we have a situation in Lab 7. The Klingon and Ferengi delegations are arguing over testing priorities." With a shared sigh, Richard and Uko followed Gron to defuse the latest crisis. Their personal concerns would have to wait. Again. As the days passed, the strain began to show. Richard and Uko found themselves working longer hours, their rare moments alone interrupted by urgent calls or unexpected crises. The constant public scrutiny added to their stress, with media drones often hovering outside their apartment, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous interspecies couple. One evening, as they prepared for yet another diplomatic dinner, Uko's frustration boiled over. "I can't remember the last time we had a real conversation that wasn't about work or politics," she said, her voice tight with emotion. Richard paused in adjusting his formal attire, turning to face her. "I know," he said softly. "This isn't what we signed up for. But the implications of our work. Our galaxy changing, I know," Uko finished for him. "But at what cost to us, Richard?" Before they could delve deeper into the conversation, their communication panel chimed urgently. Dr. Zix's face appeared, her expression grave. "You need to come to the testing lab immediately," she said. "We've encountered some unexpected results with the latest prototype." Exchanging worried glances, Richard and Uko hurried to the lab. Inside, they found a group of Bajoran test subjects undergoing various cognitive tests. Dr. Zix approached them, datapad in hand. "It's not just enhanced mobility," she explained in a hushed tone. "The subjects are reporting heightened sensory perception and improved cognitive function. It's as if the knee joint enhancements are affecting their entire nervous system." As Richard and Uko pored over the data, the implications of these developments began to sink in. Their work wasn't just changing mobility, it had the potential to alter the course of evolution for multiple species. "This changes everything," Richard said, echoing words they'd spoken so many times before. But this time, the weight of those words felt heavier than ever. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Gron, his face creased with concern. "Doctors, we have a situation," he said, his voice low and urgent. "A human fleet has just entered Bajoran space. They're demanding to speak with you immediately." Richard's heart sank as he realized the complexity of their situation had just increased exponentially. As they hurried to the communications center, he caught Uko's eye. The look they shared spoke volumes. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. But both knew that the true test of their relationship and the future of their groundbreaking work was just beginning. Beginning. The urgent tone in Gron's voice left no room for hesitation. As they hurried through the corridors of the research facility, Richard's mind raced. A human fleet in Bajoran space could only mean one thing. Earth had caught wind of their breakthrough. The implications sent a chill down his spine. They entered the bustling communications center, screens flickering with incoming transmissions and panicked chatter filling the air. At the main console stood a stern-faced human. Richard recognized immediately. General Steele, his expression a mix of drive and barely concealed aggression. "Dr. Richard, Dr. Uko," the general's voice boomed through the speakers. "I trust you understand the gravity of this situation. The United Earth government demands immediate access to all research data related to your knee joint technology." Uko stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "General Steele, with all due respect, this technology is the result of a joint Bajoran-human initiative. We have no authority to unilaterally share it with Earth." The general's eyes narrowed. "Let me be clear, doctors. This technology has implications far beyond simple medical applications. Earth will not stand by while potential weapons fall into the wrong hands." Richard felt his stomach drop. Weapons? How could their work on mobility enhancements be twisted into something so sinister? Before they could respond, a new voice cut through the chaos. "General, I believe I can shed some light on this situation." All eyes turned to see Torrin striding into the room, flanked by two Bajoran security officers. Richard's fists clenched involuntarily at the sight of the man who had caused them so much trouble. "What is the meaning of this?" Uko demanded, her eyes flashing with anger. Torrin held up his hands in a placating gesture. I come with information vital to galactic security. Your knee joint technology has been weaponized, right under your noses. The room fell silent as the weight of Toran's words sank in. Richard and Uko exchanged shocked glances, their minds reeling from the implications. Explain yourself, General Steele barked, his image looming large on the main screen. Toran nodded, his expression grim. During my absence, I uncovered evidence of a secret program within the research facility. Someone has been adapting your designs for military purposes, creating prototypes that enhance soldiers' combat abilities far beyond normal parameters. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. Could it be true? Had their work, meant to improve lives, been perverted into a tool of war? Uko's voice shook as she spoke. We need to verify these claims immediately. If there's any truth to this, we must act now. General Steele's voice cut through the room like a knife. You have 1 hour to provide me with all data related to this alleged weapons program. If you fail to comply, I will be forced to take more direct action. The transmission cut off, leaving the room in stunned silence. Richard turned to Uko, seeing his own commitment mirrored in her eyes. We need to get to the bottom of this, he said quietly. Gron stepped forward, his expression resolute. I'll assemble a team to begin a facility-wide search. If there's a hidden lab, we'll find it. As Gron left to organize the search, Richard and Uko huddled with Toran, grilling him for details about his discovery. Despite their lingering mistrust, they couldn't ignore the urgency of the situation. The lab is well hidden, Toran explained, pulling up a schematic of the facility on a nearby console. But I managed to track unusual power fluctuations to this section here. He pointed to a seemingly innocuous storage area. Without wasting another moment, Richard, Uko, and a small security team made their way to the indicated location. As they approached, Richard noticed subtle differences in the corridor, almost imperceptible variations in the wall paneling that wouldn't catch the eye of someone not looking for them. Uko ran her hand along the wall, her fingers finding a hidden seam. With a soft click, a section of the wall slid away, revealing a state-of-the-art laboratory that shouldn't have existed. They entered cautiously, their eyes widening at the sight before them. Sleek, modified knee joints lined the workbenches, each emanating a subtle glow that hinted at power far beyond standard medical applications. Holographic displays flickered with combat simulations, showing humanoid figures performing impossible feats of strength and agility. By the prophets, Uko whispered, her voice a mix of awe and horror. Richard moved to a nearby console, his fingers flying over the controls as he accessed the lab's database. His face grew increasingly pale as he scrolled through the files. Uko, look at this, he called, his voice tight. These designs, they're not just enhancing mobility. They're integrating neural interfaces, power amplification systems. These could turn an average person into a nearly unstoppable soldier. As they delved deeper into the files, the full scope of the program became clear. It wasn't just about creating super soldiers. The technology had potential applications in espionage, covert operations, and even off-world colonization under extreme conditions. A sudden realization hit Richard like a physical blow. Uko, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, do you remember all those cultural clashes we've been mediating? The constant security breaches? Uko nodded slowly, the implications dawning on her as well. It was all a cover, she said, her voice filled with disbelief. While we were distracted playing diplomat, someone was using our work to develop weapons right under our noses. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped them back to the present. They turned to see Dr. Zix entering the lab, her expression unreadable. I see you've discovered our little side project, she said, her tone unnervingly calm. Richard felt a surge of anger. You're behind this? Dr. Zix smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Not just me, Richard. This project has backers from multiple species, all interested in the military applications of your brilliant work. Uko stepped forward, her voice tight with controlled fury. How could you do this? We trusted you. It was necessary, Dr. Zix replied, her voice taking on a fervent edge. The galaxy is a dangerous place. With this technology, we can ensure peace through strength. Join us, and we can shape the future of galactic security. Richard and Uko exchanged a look, years of partnership allowing them to communicate without words. In that moment, they knew what they had to do. Never, Richard said firmly. We won't let our work be used like this. Dr. Zix's expression hardened. I'm afraid you don't have a choice. As she reached for a concealed weapon, Richard and Uko sprang into action. Years of working in a high-security environment had honed their reflexes, and they moved in perfect sync. Richard lunged for the main console, his fingers flying over the controls to initiate a data transfer. Uko, meanwhile, grabbed a prototype joint from a nearby workbench, using it to deflect Dr. Zix's weapon. In the chaos that followed, alarms blared throughout the facility. Richard and Uko fought their way out of the lab, the weight of their discovery heavy on their shoulders. As they ran, they knew that their actions in the coming hours would shape not just their own futures, but potentially the fate of the entire galaxy. They rounded a corner, nearly colliding with Gron and a group of trusted Bajoran scientists. The security chief's expression was grim as he spoke. We've got a problem. The human fleet has begun a blockade of Bajor. No ships in or out. Richard and Uko shared a determined look. Their work had started this crisis, and now it was up to them to end it. As they hurried to formulate a plan, the fate of interspecies relations hung in the balance, with the looming threat of war casting a shadow over everything they had worked for. Richard and Uko exchanged a determined look as they processed Gron's news about the human blockade. They knew they had to act fast. We need to get to the data center, Richard said, his voice low and urgent. That's where we'll find the proof we need to expose this conspiracy. Uko nodded, her eyes gleaming with grit. Agreed, but we can't do this alone. They quickly assembled a team of trusted allies. Gron, whose security expertise would be invaluable, Toran, despite their lingering mistrust, and a handful of Bajoran scientists who had remained loyal throughout the chaos. As they made their way through the facility's winding corridors, Richard felt a surge of gratitude for the knee-joint technology they had developed. The enhanced mobility allowed them to move swiftly and silently, avoiding detection by the regular security patrols. Their first obstacle came in the form of a biometric scanner guarding the entrance to the high-security wing. Gron stepped forward, producing a device he had prepared for just such an occasion. With a few deft movements, he bypassed the scanner, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, they encountered a new challenge: robotic guards patrolling the hallways with mechanical precision. Toran, proving his worth, used his knowledge of the facility's systems to create a distraction, sending the robots to investigate a false alarm in another sector. As they approached the central database, the air grew thick with tension. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of what was at stake. The data center itself was a marvel of technology, banks of servers humming with impossibly strong power. At its center stood a holographic interface, casting an eerie blue glow over the room. Richard and Uko approached the main console, their fingers flying over the controls as they attempted to access the classified files. Suddenly, a warning flashed across the screen. "It's a failsafe," Uko said, her voice tight with concern. "If we don't crack this in time, everything will be wiped." Richard nodded, his mind racing. Dr. Zix designed this system. She would have used principles from our joint research. Together they began to work, their years of partnership allowing them to anticipate each other's moves. They applied their intimate knowledge of the knee-joint technology to decode Dr. Zix's complex algorithms, each breakthrough bringing them closer to their goal. As the final firewall fell, alarms blared throughout the facility. Richard's stomach dropped as he realized they were out of time. "Download everything," he commanded, inserting a data crystal into the console. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Gron peered through the doorway, his expression grim. "We've got company, and they're not standard security forces." A group of soldiers burst into the room, their movements unnaturally swift and precise. Richard's eyes widened as he recognized the telltale glow emanating from their knee joints. These were the weaponized prototypes in action. "Run!" Uko shouted, grabbing the data crystal as it ejected from the console. What followed was a heart-pounding chase through the labyrinthine corridors of the data center. Richard and his team used every ounce of their enhanced agility to stay ahead of their pursuers, vaulting over obstacles and squeezing through narrow maintenance shafts. As they approached a junction, Torin suddenly stopped. "There's no time," he said, his voice filled with a mix of fear and drive. "I'll hold them off. You get that data out." Before anyone could protest, Torin turned to face the oncoming soldiers, using his knowledge of the facility to seal off the corridor behind him. Richard felt a pang of regret as they left Torin behind, the sound of energy weapons echoing in their wake. There was no time for mourning. They had to reach the hangar bay. They burst into the cavernous space, alarms still blaring around them. Uko's eyes locked onto a sleek Bajoran shuttle. "There!" she shouted, already sprinting towards it. As they piled into the craft, Richard's hands flew over the controls, initiating the launch sequence. The hangar bay doors began to open, revealing the star-studded expanse of space beyond. The shuttle rocketed out of the facility, immediately finding itself in the midst of a tense standoff between the gathered alien fleets. Richard's comm panel crackled to life, General Steele's face appearing on the screen. "Dr. Richard," the general's voice was cold with fury, "you will stand down and prepare to be boarded." Richard's mind raced, knowing they had only moments before the human fleet would move to intercept them. He made a split-second decision that would change the course of galactic history. "Uko, help me route the shuttle's communication systems through the data crystal," he said, his fingers already dancing across the controls. Understanding dawned in Uko's eyes as she complied. Together, they prepared to broadcast the stolen data to every ship in orbit and to news outlets across the galaxy. As the transmission began, chaos erupted among the gathered fleets. Some ships powered down their weapons, while others turned on their former allies. Amidst the confusion, a sleek vessel with unfamiliar markings approached their shuttle. A new face appeared on their comm screen, a Zenovian captain, her features both alien and strikingly beautiful. "Dr. Richard, Dr. Uko," she said, her voice calm amidst the storm, "I offer you asylum aboard my vessel. We've been monitoring the situation, and we believe your work is too important to be lost in this conflict." Richard and Uko shared a look, years of partnership allowing them to communicate without words. They knew their lives would never be the same, but the prospect of continuing their research, free from political machinations, was too tempting to resist. As their shuttle docked with the Zenovian ship, Richard took one last look at the chaos they were leaving behind. The Bajoran government was in turmoil, alien diplomats were being recalled, and General Steele's fleet was reluctantly withdrawing. The Zenovian captain greeted them as they boarded, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "I have a proposal for you," she said, leading them towards the ship's bridge. "How would you like to explore the far reaches of the galaxy, studying alien environments previously inaccessible to our kind?" Richard felt a spark of excitement ignite in his chest, mirrored in Uko's expression. As they looked out at the vast expanse of stars stretching before them, he realized that their journey, both personal and scientific, was a long way to go. The galaxy had been irrevocably changed by the events surrounding their knee-joint technology. As the Zenovian ship prepared to jump to hyperspace, Richard and Uko stood hand in hand, their different physiologies a testament to the challenges they had overcome and those that still lay ahead. The stars blurred into streaks of light, carrying them towards an uncertain but thrilling future. Whatever dangers or discoveries awaited them, Richard knew one thing for certain. He and Uko would face them together, as they always had. The stars blurred into streaks of light, carrying them towards an uncertain but thrilling future. As Richard and Uko stood hand in hand on the bridge of the Zenovian ship, a sudden alert caught their attention. The ship's communication system flashed urgently, indicating an incoming transmission. The Zenovian captain frowned, her delicate features creasing with concern. "It's encrypted," she said, her fingers dancing over the controls. "And it's addressed to you two specifically." Richard and Uko exchanged a puzzled glance. Who could be contacting them now, after everything that had happened? The captain nodded, giving them permission to accept the transmission. The holographic display flickered to life, revealing a face they never expected to see again. Dr. Zix. Her appearance was haggard, her eyes darting nervously as if expecting to be discovered at any moment. "Dr. Richard, Dr. Uko," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but please, I beg you to listen." Richard felt Uko's hand tighten around his, a silent reminder of the betrayal they had suffered at Dr. Zix's hands. Yet something in the desperate tone of her voice gave him pause. Dr. Zix continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "During my exile, I've discovered something extraordinary. A planet far from the usual trade routes, home to a community of outcasts from various species. They all share one commonality: severe mobility limitations that made them pariahs in their own worlds." Uko leaned forward, her scientific curiosity piqued despite her lingering mistrust. "Go on," she urged. "The planet's environment is brutal," Dr. Zix explained, her image flickering as if the connection might be lost at any moment. "Treacherous terrain, corrosive atmosphere, dangerous native fauna. These beings are struggling to survive, and I can't help them alone. Your knee-joint technology could be their salvation." Richard felt a familiar spark of excitement ignite in his chest. He glanced at Uko, seeing the same mix of caution and intrigue reflected in her eyes. "Send us the coordinates," Richard said, his decision made in that instant. The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in silence. The Zenovian captain turned to them, her alien features unreadable. "Are you certain about this?" she asked. Uko nodded, her voice firm. "We are. Captain, would you be willing to set a course for these coordinates?" The journey took them through uncharted regions of space, past swirling nebulae and the gravitational pulls of unknown stars. When they finally dropped out of hyperspace, the sight that greeted them was breathtaking. The planet hung in space like a jewel, its surface a tapestry of deep purples and swirling greens. But as they entered the atmosphere, the harsh reality became apparent. The air shimmered with a faint acidic haze, and the landscape below was a treacherous maze of jagged rock formations and unstable terrain. They sat down near a sprawling collection of makeshift shelters, constructed from salvaged spacecraft parts and local materials. As the ship's ramp lowered, Richard and Uko were hit by a wave of hot, acrid air that made their eyes water. A group of aliens approached, their movements painfully slow and labored. Richard's heart clenched as he saw the diversity of species represented, each one struggling in their own way against the planet's unforgiving environment. A tall, spindly being with multiple limbs shuffled forward, supported by a crude exoskeleton. "Welcome," it said, its voice a melodious whisper. "I am Xylo, the elected spokesperson for our community. Dr. Zix informed us of your potential arrival. We had almost given up hope." Richard stepped forward, careful to match his pace to Xylo's. "We're here to help," he said, gesturing to the equipment they had brought. "But first, we need to understand the unique challenges you're facing." Over the next few days, Richard and Uko immersed themselves in the community, learning the stories of each individual and the specific difficulties posed by their physiology and the hostile environment. They set up a base camp, working tirelessly to adapt their knee-joint technology to suit the diverse needs of the colonists. The challenges were immense. Creating universal adapters for vastly different body structures proved to be a complex engineering feat. Ensuring the new joints could withstand the planet's corrosive atmosphere required developing entirely new alloys. Weeks turned into months as they refined their designs. The Zenovian crew proved invaluable, offering insights from their own advanced technology and helping to manufacture prototypes. Dr. Zix, seeking redemption, worked alongside them, her expertise in xenobiology crucial to their efforts. As they worked, Richard and Uko found themselves growing closer to the colonists. They shared meals, learned alien games, and listened to stories of distant worlds and the circumstances that had brought each being to this harsh planet. What had begun as a scientific mission transformed into something deeper, a shared struggle against adversity, a testament to the resilience of life in all its forms. News of their work spread throughout the galaxy. Species who had withdrawn support after the weaponization scandal cautiously reached out, offering resources and expertise. The planet, once a hidden refuge for outcasts, became a symbol of redemption and interspecies cooperation. Finally, after months of tireless work, the day arrived for the first mass implementation of the adapted knee joints. Richard and Uko worked side by side, fitting colonist after colonist with their new limbs. The air was thick with anticipation as the first recipients took their inaugural steps. Xylo, the community spokesperson, was among the first. As the new joints whirred to life, allowing for smooth, controlled movement, tears welled in their multiple eyes. With a grace that seemed impossible just moments before, Xylo took a step, then another, each movement becoming more confident. A cheer went up from the gathered crowd, a cacophony of alien voices united in joy. Richard felt Uko's hand slip into his, and he turned to see her eyes shining with unshed tears. In that moment, surrounded by the triumph of science and the power of compassion, they knew they had found their true calling. As the day wore on and more colonists experienced their newfound mobility, the once struggling settlement seemed to pulse with new life. Plans for expansion, for gardens and workshops and schools, were already being discussed with newfound optimism. That evening, as twin moons rose over the alien landscape, Richard and Uko stood at the edge of the settlement. The harsh wind that had once threatened to topple the fragile shelters now carried the sounds of laughter and celebration. "We've done good work here," Uko said, her voice soft with wonder. Richard nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. "We have," he agreed. "But I think this is just the beginning." As they gazed out at the community they had helped transform, a shared understanding passed between them. Their journey, not nearly finished, had opened up a new chapter, one filled with promise, challenges, and the boundless potential of interspecies cooperation. The once hostile planet, with its treacherous beauty, now felt like the start of something extraordinary. As night fell and the celebration continued behind them, Richard and Uko stood hand in hand, ready to face whatever the future might bring.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.